Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Peristyle once again. It's such a beautiful place for a talk, and this is going to be a terrific one, I assure you. You know what a peristyle means, do you? I'm sure there's some of you who do. An area surrounded by columns. Yes, indeed, a peristyle. And so this peristyle, as many of you know, was opened in 1933. It has been the distinguished result of the vision of Florence Scott Libby. It was designed by Edward Green, who designed our building here, our original building. It has 1,750 seats. That's a lot of seats. About 600 here in the center. And 28 ionic columns. So when you're asked how many columns around, the answer is 28. And they are Vermont marble, like the front of the building. I just thought I'd tell you all of that today. In preparation for this Master Series event, and the Master Series has been a wonderful additional program that we've added to the Peristyle in recent years, and it's brought renowned artists and scholars and musicians and others to offer these free talks to the public and opportunities to engage with great people. It's made possible by our Toledo Museum of Art ambassadors, and I would ask, are any of our ambassadors here present? And if so, why don't they stand up and we thank them? Go on, try it. We thank our ambassadors for all the great work that they do. Yark Automotive Group have also joined with us in supporting the Masters Series. And before I forget it, oh, here's Yark Automotive. Good. You want to stand up too? Before I forget it, can you turn your phones to silent, please, if you haven't done so? Now, our wonderful exhibition, Degas and the Dance, I want to thank our sponsors there as well. Welltower, formerly Healthcare REIT, with Christie's and Taylor Cadillac have made our exhibition possible. And it is a wonderful exhibition with an integrated dance floor, which makes it very, very unusual in Degas exhibitions. I want to just mention that on February 11, we're having our next Master Series, and it will be the opening of our exhibition of masterworks from the Diker collection of Native American art. This is the most important private collection of Native American art in the country, which we'll be showing here in Toledo Museum of Art. And Chuck and Val Diker will join me on the stage here on February the 11th with our curator of the show, David Penny from the National Museum of the American Indian. So I encourage you to come then on February 11. There are microphones at the side here where we can invite you to ask questions after our talk this evening. And just a couple of last mentions. Our sneaker celebration. Yes, you all have sneakers, or you should be asking them for them all over the holidays, because you're going to need them on January the 2nd. We're going to have a huge party here. So just after New Year, January 2nd, is our sneaker celebration from 6 to 10 p.m., okay, on the 2nd. And the next day, January the 3rd, we will have a performance called Awkward Girl by the Toledo Ballet, which features the awkward girl who is the young dancer at the age of 14 wearing the tutu that I imagine you will see in tonight's talk and which graces our beautiful Degas show currently. Now, last thing I have to do this evening is to introduce Larry Nichols. Dr. Larry Nichols is William Hutton, Senior Curator of European and American Painting and Sculpture before 1900 at the Toledo Museum of Art. He has a connection to Dartmouth College because he went there, and I spent 5 years there as director of the Hood Museum of Art. Our speaker this evening is a board member of the Hood Museum of Art and also went to Dartmouth. So with that link of web of connection, can I invite you to make Larry Nichols welcome?
Thank you, Brian. I would begin my introduction of this evening's speaker with a quote. A host of explanations can be offered for Degas' interest in dancers and dancing. In the dance, he found a subject that conflated the natural, unguarded gestures of dancers at rest and the highly artificial movements of the classical ballet. In this respect, dancers were the ideal models for an artist torn between an almost obsessive interest in the idiosyncratic and individual, and an equally fine-tuned appreciation for the exquisitely beautiful. So wrote George Shackelford in the first of his 3 publications that accompanied exhibitions devoted to the art of Edgar Degas that he organized, they being Degas and the Dance of 1984, presented at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, Degas Landscapes, 1994, held at the Met in New York and the MFA Houston, and Degas and the Nude, 2011, on view at the MFA Boston and the Musée d'Orsay, Paris. To be sure, therefore, our speaker is an acknowledged expert on the artist featured in our current exhibition on view through January 10th in the museum's Canada Gallery, Degas and the Dance, organized on the occasion of the Toledo Ballet's 75th anniversary of consecutively presenting The Nutcracker, which, if you haven't already bought your tickets for this weekend's performance, you should do so pronto. And I make bold and urge you to head for the Sunday matinee, during which yours truly makes his thespian debut in the role of Mother Ginger. George hails from Louisiana. Evidence of this will quickly manifest itself the moment he commences addressing us all. He took his undergraduate degree, as you've heard, from Dartmouth, graduating in 1977, and a year before I did so myself. And yes, indeed, we did take art history courses together. George did his graduate work at Yale, completing his degree, PhD in '86, his thesis being on, guess what, the subject of Degas' Dancers, the completion of which was aided by his having been the David E. Finley Fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery. His museum career commenced at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, where he served as curator of European painting and sculpture from 1984 to 95. It continued in Boston at the MFA, where for 15 years he held the position of chair of the Department of Art of Europe. In January 2012, he joined the staff of the Kimbell Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas, as deputy director, where he also maintains the title of chief curator. George has served as a member of the Arts and Artifacts Advisory Panel to the Federal Council on the Arts and Humanities, which is that organization that indemnifies, fancy word for insurance, many exhibitions that keep our exhibition program going in the States. In 2005, he was elected as Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters of the Republic of France and was named an officer in 2012. He was a founding trustee of the Association of Art Museum Curators and served as its president from 2006 to 10. Besides studying Degas, George has organized exhibitions on Monet in the 20th century, Marie Cassatt, the portraiture of Van Gogh, and Gauguin's Tahitian imagery. And on view at the Kimbell at present is his stunning show on Gustav Caillebotte, which I was able to see last month. It's utterly spellbinding. Up next for him, 2 shows, the early works of Monet and the late works of Monet. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to George Shackelford.
Thank you, Larry. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I'm perfectly exhausted from hearing about that poor person who did all that. It is wonderful to be back speaking in Toledo again. I was here to talk about Van Gogh's Harvests, 10 years ago maybe, and it was such a wonderful occasion. And to be back talking about Degas, which is one of the center of my intellectual heartland, if you will, is a great, great pleasure. Tonight I bring you some thoughts about Degas and the dance, and his fascination with the dance, and the characteristics of his art that are actually sort of reflected in his choice of the dance as a subject. And let's go ahead and begin with the first. I called my talk Degas Dance Music Time, and those of you who are fans of the 17th century will recognize a reference to Nicolas Poussin's great A Dance to the Music of Time at the Wallace Collection in London, which I pair with the great late pastel of Degas' Dancers that's here and one of the glories of the Toledo Museum of Art's collection. I do this just because, first of all, it makes such a great title, but not only is dance and music at the center of Degas' preoccupation with the ballet, but also issues of time, not only the counting of time and time, things that take time and things that happen across time, but also I'll be focusing on the arc of his career and the fact that dance begins with him as a subject in the late 1860s and is still interesting him well after 1900. The Toledo Museum of Art has 3 great Degas dance images, not only the wonderful pastel, one of the most beautiful of a series of pastels, which I'll show you some more of later, the bronze cast after Degas' death of the model, the nude model for the little 14-year-old dancer. All of these, just the Degas that are at Toledo on the subject of the dance, and this wonderful late charcoal and pastel drawing on tracing paper for one of the double square, twice as wide as they are tall, dance rehearsals that were a fascination for him over the course of about 25 years. But to just give you a little background, Degas is born in Paris in 1834. His father had been born in Naples, his mother had been born in New Orleans, and these two exiled French people, expats, move back to Paris with their families and meet each other, and Degas is their firstborn son. He's very talented from the beginning. He is told by his parents that he has to pursue a career in the law, but almost immediately begins to register as a copyist at the Louvre. And then after a year of somewhat, well, I'm not sure how much he got out of it, but something, study with the painter Louis Lamotte at the École des Beaux-Arts, he goes on and moves to Rome, where he studies not as an official scholar of the Academy of France in Rome, but as a kind of unofficial participant in their study sessions. It's there in Rome and in Florence that he copies from the antique, and that he learns to draw the nude model as well, and learning specifically a lot about the rendering of the human body under different conditions of light from different points of view. Here are 2 studies of a model who was a relatively famous model at the time. We don't know his name, but you see his face in the work of a lot of artists. And he also began to sketch rather interestingly and somewhat idly from time to time. Here's a page of little doodles, basically, from a notebook that's at the Louvre with studies after Roman portrait sculpture, scenes from daily life, a copy after Holy Family, perhaps, down here, and then wonderfully a number of studies of his own hand. These are his all left hands here. He was right-handed, so he's actually using the blank spaces in the paper to draw images of himself. These are probably done when he's in his early 20s. And he shows very early on a capacity for doing different kinds of lines. You saw those, the sort of soft lines of pencil there, but he was equally adept at making ink lines. This wonderful sheet, again from a notebook, that compares drawings that are relatively naturalistic, this profile head, with those that are almost caricatural here. And you get the sense that these are really a person and that this is probably someone that he wanted to just make a little sort of foolish image of. But portraiture, which his father predicted would be the great focus of his career, was early on one of his most important subjects. And no greater work from this period exists than the Ballet family, which he begins in Florence about 1859 and doesn't finish until he's ready to send it to the Salon in Paris in 1865. The studies that he makes for it are among the most beautiful drawings in his career, and I'm particularly fond of the head at the Louvre. It belongs to the Musée d'Orsay, kept at the Louvre, of his little cousin, Giulia Bellelli, who is here. His aunt, Laura Bellelli, was one of his father's sisters who had remained in Italy, married an Italian, was in a rather unhappy marriage, as you might sense from the sort of body language of the picture. And in making a painting like this, Degas was participating in a long line of artists, who, even French artists, who came to Italy and who made portraiture a big part of their world. Ingres is a good example, who made his living drawing itinerant families who were in Rome just for a brief time, whether they were English or French, or they could be German even, and who later was known for his great portrait drawings here of Madame Moitessier. But I think also the character of the drawing in the head of Giulia Bellelli owes something to Degas' fascination with old master drawings. And here a sheet around the work of Leonardo da Vinci, in which I think Degas is deliberately copying the sort of sfumato or smoky effects that Leonardo was known for. Just another last chance to see Giulia before we turn to among Degas' first dancers. This figure, I show you two views of the same sheet, is, I think, one of the most beautiful of Degas' drawings from the late 1850s, early 1860s. It's a study for a painting called Semiramis Constructing Babylon, which is at the Musée d'Orsay. And here is this figure, excuse me, I'm learning my thing, appears, she's vaguely related to this, but she doesn't come in exactly as she was drawn here. And this large painting, which was never finished and is frankly a bit of a muddle, was derived from an opera by Donizetti on the subject of this ancient Babylonian queen, which was played at the Paris Opera. I gather you all heard a wonderful lecture about opera and ballet here just a few weeks ago. And so you will have learned something about the nature of the opera, which was where the ballet actually resided in 19th century France. So this figure of a sort of vaguely dancing woman, which goes back to antiquity in the whole conception of this piece, is Degas doing a dancer a little bit in the antique mode. In fact, ancient art and ancient subject matter was to preoccupy Degas in the early 1860s when he was doing scenes from the Bible or from ancient history, or in this case, the young Spartans. I show you two studies. In fact, the painting at the left in the Art Institute of Chicago is, I think, a first layer of a painting that was abandoned and eventually reworked in a painting now at London at the National Gallery. And I show you one of the wonderful studies for it. And I picked this sheet out because you'll see me coming back to it later. But there's the guy in the painting here who is just barely in the picture. And in Toledo, you have a wonderful drawing relating to the boy who is just down here, barely in the picture. You get a little bit more of him in the London view. And this drawing from the early 1860s conceivably begun the kinds of drawings that Degas might have begun working on in Rome, but most likely when he's back in Paris and is beginning this preparation for this, what was going to be for him a major picture to send to the Salon, which he did not, we think, end up doing. But Degas' technique changed radically, or broadened, shall we say, radically over the course of the next few years, so that by the end of the 1860s, he was equally adept at making things that we would really think of almost as painted drawings. The technique of the sheet that's on the left here a woman, a half-naked woman bending over, is actually in a liquid medium, Degas' favorite medium of what was called in French peinture à l'essence, or painting with a spirit, namely like a turpentine spirit or a mineral spirit, where he would dilute oil paint to the consistency of gouache or opaque watercolor and paint with that onto a sheet of paper. He ends up with an effect that's really very like the kinds of lyrical passages that Delacroix achieves in pastel. This study relates to the figure in Degas' painting that he called interior, and which was in the 20th century generally called by the term, or by the title, the rape, for conceivably obvious reasons, the tension between the man and the woman being so thick you could cut it with a knife. This difference from the academic nude, the nude of ancient Greece, to the modern nude, signal a change in Degas' art towards modern subject matter. And he essentially, at this point, never turns back. In part, I think, we can attribute some of this turn to his familiarity and his new friendship with Edouard Manet, who he met at the Louvre while Manet was in the process of copying onto an etching plate a work by Velázquez. And this notion of painting, of meeting an artist like Manet, who was known for his dandyism, for his spirit of being a man about town, a wanderer in the streets who observed and recorded what the French in that time and Baudelaire called the flâneur, the man who wanders and observes, records, and then tells again what he has seen. Degas, in that mode, tipping his hat to us from a portrait at the Gulbenkian Foundation, is the artist who turns to portraiture of a very different kind, a very relaxed portraiture. Here, the image of his friend Victoria Dubourg, who was the wife of the painter Fontaine-Latour, herself a painter of flowers as well, in the great canvas upstairs at the Toledo Museum of Art. And this kind of portraiture, which sort of teeters on the edge between being a subject painting and an image and a likeness, is one of the areas in which Degas really excelled and maybe even broke ground. Because here in the Collector of Prints, we're certain that the man is a known individual, that somebody that Degas knew. We should know his name, but we don't. At the right, we have Degas' father bending over and listening attentively to the songs of Lorenzo Pagans, a Spanish singer who was employed often to perform in people's apartments after dinner, and was a friend of the Degas family. And here he is singing in Degas' father's home. These paintings, which are half portraits, half images from daily life, lead Degas into the world of pictures that are really pretty much completely drawn from daily life, like the racehorses, the laundry, and the world of music. Degas was a friend of the bassoonist who is shown here at the center of this painting, a man named Désiré Diau, D-I-H-A-U, who was the head bassoonist at the Paris Opera Orchestra, and whom Degas had met, perhaps even through his sister Marie, who like Pagans, was a singer and musician who would come and perform in people's homes after dinner or for musical evenings. He decided to paint a portrait of Diau, very much like the portrait of Pagans or like the portrait of the Collector of Prints. In other words, an image of someone occupied in the process of their daily life, or in what they did from day to day and what their profession was. This is the first time that the ballet appears in the art of Edgar Degas. And here it is, just, excuse me, I'm backing up here instead. And there it is up here. And it's just literally the headless bodies of the dancers skittering around on the stage up above the heads of the orchestra members, but being gazed upon by a lone man here. You often see men on the edges of Degas' images of the ballet staring at the dancers This man who was actually a composer who is sitting in a box that's actually on the stage looking over at the dancers whose legs were the primary source of interest for many men of the Paris Opera subscribers. This is one of the cliches about the ballet of the Paris Opera was it was the source of mistresses for the members of the Jockey Club. This is the story that was just automatically assumed and understood by people who were the viewers, the first viewers of these paintings. When Degas turned to the world of the dance class, it was with a notion, I think, of picking a subject for himself that nobody else was doing. And he created two paintings, very small, they're about this big, you can see my hands, that were on the theme of the ballet class, the repetition of the ballet, the instruction, the rehearsal, the dancers in their work environment as Désiré had been shown in his work environment. And these paintings quite rightly have been compared to Dutch old master paintings, and Degas said famously that he and Whistler and Fontaine all began on the road from Holland, and acknowledged the importance of 17th century genre painting for their early work. Here in this diminutive painting at the Metropolitan, we see the dancer stepping out, executing a step, while all around her, the rest of her dancer friends are stretching, bending, scratching, leaning, talking, basically doing anything but dancing. But seated in just by the piano, which is being used as much as a prop, as a musical instrument, is one of the violinists who would be employed to play a tune for the dancers to dance to. That notion of a musician being in charge of making the rhythm which the dancers would follow pervades a number of early compositions by Degas, including this one, the other small picture that was at the beginning of his career, in which he exhibited at the First Impressionist exhibition in 1874, which shows the dance master, Louis Merant, here, and a friend of Degas who was a violinist in the opera orchestra as well. And here in an interior vaguely based on the old rehearsal rooms of the Rue Le Pelletier Opera House, which burned down in the 1870s, Degas shows a ballet class underway. Now, he becomes fascinated by these themes. And while we feel sure that he had some access to the actual rooms in which they were painted, we don't think that he was particularly scrupulous about painting things in a very, very repertorial way, so that the shapes of his rooms seem to keep shifting, and they follow pictorial devices as much as they do ones of actually reporting on what happened in the theaters and in their rehearsal rooms. Remember, I said there's almost always a man present in a Degas. There, can you see that little black stripe? That's a man behind the column. Or it could be the dance master himself, shown over here. There's quite often also a stage mother. Larry used the term today, soccer mom, but it's kind of the tiger soccer mom, I think, who was intent on the success of her daughter in this ballet profession. The people who were ballerinas were often from the lower middle classes, certainly not aristocratic people. They were people who hadn't gone to school typically, who entered the course of the ballet very early in life, as a child even, and they were lucky if they succeeded in rising up to the role of being a star or a featured performer. Many of them were instead going to be in the chorus and sort of nameless, personality-less dancers in the background. Only occasionally do they step out in Degas' art in particularly starring roles. Most often he gives them a starring role, as this dancer here, through her very simplicity and, if you will, and I say this in the nicest way, ordinariness. She's cold. She's keeping her body warm by pulling that shawl on around her while she's sitting still so that she doesn't, her body doesn't tense up or seize up on her. Dancing to the music, you can almost hear the beat of the violin with this dancer who seems to be lifting her leg in precise rhythm with the music. And this kind of notion of the dancer at work in these classrooms, again, was one of Degas' preoccupations in the earlier 1870s. Around that time, he embarked on a series of drawings of one dancer. And here are two beautiful sheets, the one on the left from the Fog Art Museum and the one on the right from Detroit, which show the very same dancer. You can see that the elements of her costume are the same. She's got the bracelets on in both cases. She has the sort of bodice is quite low cut here. He's used the same bit of white chalk to heighten the color of that bodice. Her shoelaces are in exactly the same position. She's got the right bow. The hairdo is the same. So here he's taking one model and over the course of perhaps an afternoon, making several drawings of her. And here's a third one at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And these drawings were almost certainly all the same color ones. This is a little lesson to you in what now, of course, my slides are off of the internet, and who knows whether they're correct. But I can tell you that the drawing in the middle is really faded, and the other two are in better condition. And this is a little lesson to you on why you should not leave a print or a drawing in the sunlight, is that the color on it will fade. So the sheet at the Fog Art Museum is perhaps the best preserved, Detroit next, and the one at the Metropolitan often exhibited and left out, frankly, in someone's apartment for a long time, has lost some of its pink color. But these three sheets are very important for Degas because he used them again and again. You can see that the figure here derives from this sheet. This figure, I think, is here someplace, but now I can't find her. Maybe back in here, yes, right there. And then she appears here again, and the figure from Detroit is just there. And this is the wonderful dance class, which is in the exhibition upstairs from the Louvre, begun probably in the mid-1870s, begun and finished in the mid-1870s, but with a little bit of a lapse where Degas began working on yet another painting. This was to be painted on spec on commission for a collector. He couldn't finish it right. He started a brand new, different composition, which I'll show you in a moment, and came back to this one only later, having substantially reworked parts of it. So there's the other figure just here. And then, where's this girl? Well, she used to be here, but she isn't any longer. And if I can walk you through it, here she is. There's her head. There's her arm going here. Here's her leg. That's her shin. And her the leg that she's standing on. And there going down is her hand reaching down to touch her ankle. There was another guy in the painting as well, and here he is. I think you can see him pretty clearly. And instead, Degas went in and changed everything and covered over the previous ballet master with this man and adds to it this wonderful painting, also in the exhibition upstairs, painting from Boston, who he includes just behind the man there. This is a very big painting, and you'll see when you see the picture, this picture is actually in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. When you go to see it in New York, you'll see that she's just a tiny little element here. And Degas has painted that little element from a really rather large painting. So here we have the second version of the painting, which is probably finished before the first version, if you will. And here you can see the head and the ear, and something perhaps even of the suggestion of where the arm used to be of that dancer who was leaning down. He adds to it other figures. Here's a version of this figure here, and the wonderful drawing of legs, which enables him to do these beautiful feet here, and some of the dancer's legs as they go into the distance just there, used again here. But he wasn't through with this idea, because this figure, and this is where we get into the notion of time with Degas, repetition is really the hallmark of Degas' art. And it's not just at the beginning of his career, it really is a lifelong preoccupation for him. Because that figure that he liked so much, he probably has a second version of that drawing. And he makes it be the centerpiece of this wonderful sheet from the Norton Simon Museum of Art, in which if I had a better photograph, I could let you see that down here, the whole paper has been extended at the bottom, and it's been extended up here on the side as well. And so what was another drawing looking like this one has become a fully fledged painting on paper. And there she is again, peering out from behind a screen at one of the stage flats of the opera. They're sort of in between motions on the stage. And she's accompanied by another dancer who we'll see reappear in a drawing, this one from the Falkenfeld collection in Zurich. And she reappears here in a painting now at Philadelphia. There's the dance master again. And this notion of the reappearing figure, here's a figure that could have been from the same model. Here she is in a drawing, in a wonderful study of her head and the back end of this figure. This painting is in the, let me just back up and remind you that this painting is in the exhibition as well from the National Gallery of Art. And here's the figure there. Here's a study that is of her head and this figure sitting in the chair. And then this drawing gets repeated and repeated and repeated. And though I have them here in this order, there's no indication at all that this is the actual order of their execution. You could mix it all around, and who knows in which one happened first. None of them is signed or dated. These little, these little red marks, by the way, which you'll see on works by Degas, are little stamps of his signature put onto all of his unsigned drawings when they were still in his studio after his death. So that whole notion of repetition of a particularly favored pose or model is, as I said, an idea that extends across his lifetime. And it extends also into the making of duplicate or variant canvases. So for the picture upstairs in the exhibition, there's this other variant here. For this painting at Yale, at Yale, The Gift of Duncan Phillips, is this other one at the National Gallery of Art, which includes, by the way, this missing figure is down here under the present surface, down below. You can see it in an X-ray. And then here is the drawing in Toledo, which is, I think, probably traced off of this canvas, in which the painted surface, I think, completely obscures a much earlier painting. So if this surface is 1900, beneath it there is a painting of 1880. I still haven't been able to get the Bürle collection in Zurich to X-ray this to confirm it for me. But it's at the time of reworking this surface around 1900 that Degas comes and makes the version in Toledo, and yet another version, more fully worked, in the Wallraf-Richartz Museum in Cologne. So all of these exist at the same time, though this one, in fact, hides another image from a much earlier date. This notion of working across time and the movement from picture to picture also has to do with Degas' fascination with space and with the movement of the artist himself and of his models. So the figure here that we showed from that earlier drawing here can be related to drawings like this one, a beautiful sheet in Philadelphia, I think maybe made from the same model as this figure over here. And recombined, there she is again in a variant version, recombined with other figures in a drawing that is marked up here, vue de dessus, or seen from above. Degas remarking on the fact that he was high, looking down onto the dancers. So he's commenting to us, the viewer, on his position vis-a-vis his models. It's not surprising then that in terms of doing this, he is interested in actual movements and in positioning himself vis-a-vis his models in ways that are unexpected. Here, he's making lots of comments on the dancer and her ability to do this or that. He's telling us here that her arm is really not being held in the right position. And when he uses these figures again, they get incorporated again and again in these images. Sometimes he does a drawing that doesn't have any future use. Here, a young, very young rat of the Paris Opera, a very little girl. And these caricatures, in this case, I think, almost certainly done from memory rather than from life. And here one that's very definitely done from life, giving us every sense of the dancer's weariness. Dancing was hard work, you know, and it still is. And I think if you come tomorrow night to the Toledo Museum of Art and see the dancers rehearsing in the exhibition, you'll get a sense of what it is to actually work as a dancer. Now, this notion of using the body to reflect character and using pose and the sort of expression of the body as an expression of meaning goes back to a friend of Degas, or rather, the Degas friend articulated it. It comes out of Degas himself. But his friend Edmond Duranty in 1876 published an essay in the 1876 Impressionist exhibition catalog called The New Painting, in which he commented on how we should change our point of view about looking at things, how we ought not to always accept the symmetrical from the very middle view. We ought to look at things askance, from high up, from below, from the side, in a different way than sort of classical, theatrically composed neoclassical pictures. And along with this, Duranty, aping Degas, encourages people to look at the body, the face, the expressions of meaning and of character that could be elicited not only from a facial expression, from the cast of the eyes, from the set of the mouth, but also from the pose of the body, the way the shoulders were held, the position of the back, the way a man or a woman walks. And all of these elements could give us a more realistic, naturalistic sense of modern life, that being the subject. So back to the notion of being seen from above, you're looking down on this figure, you're looking down on these people, and that takes us to the box in the opera. This is a wonderful pastel in a private collection in which these figures you see, all three of these down here, have been reshuffled and get posed on the stage down below where a woman with a white kid glove and a terrific, not a lorgnette, it's a sort of opera glasses here, her fan unfolded. We sense that we must be standing up over her, looking down over her lap onto the stage. We're therefore almost certainly put in the position of being Degas, a man standing behind her rather than a woman. And this is a notion that gets done again and again in Degas' art. There's several of these that are all extraordinarily beautiful and show that notion of an uncharacteristic or an unanticipated view from high up. The view could either be from high up or from below. Here we're back to the idea of being in the orchestra, though we're here in an outdoor café concert looking up at one of the singers seated on the, or they're standing and singing out in front of her seated companions on the stage of an outdoor beer hall. This notion of looking at architecture, at looking at the city from different angles. Here he is looking out of a window at the courtyard of a Parisian building. Here at the Cirque Fernando, which was an indoor circus that was held in Paris, looking up into the rafters, and this view perhaps inspiring the view out of the back of this wonderful painting in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow called A Dancer Posing for the Photographer. And here she is standing in a studio called a photographer's studio, that I think it may just as easily be a painter's studio, with a mirror. Can you see that just here at the edge, there is the edge of a standing mirror? That mirror is perhaps a little clearer when I show you a picture by Degas' friend Manzi of Degas in ballet tights, standing looking into a mirror. And the mirror here is here. I'm sure Manzi knew it, and Degas is betraying it because Degas was fascinated by using a mirror as a tool in drawing. And in fact, it was a drawing exercise that he mentions at about the time that he is beginning work on the little 14-year-old dancer. That is to say, probably around 1879. Now, the little 14-year-old dancer model was a girl named Marie van Goerten. We know this from an inscription on one of the drawings of her head that is in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And she was about 14 years old in about 1879. So we're thinking that, that the project began around that moment. The finished wax was completed in 1881 and exhibited in the Impressionist exhibition in that year. And you're seeing here a photograph not of the bronze cast that's in your exhibition in Toledo, but instead of the original wax sculpture that's in the Mellon collection at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And when you're in Washington, I urge you to go to see it because it has characteristics that are very different from the bronze casts which were made after Degas died. The little 14-year-old dancer is, and here I show you a detail of her head, is actually sculpted in a kind of wax, but incorporates elements that are more like doll clothes than anything else. And we know that Degas had written into his notebook an address of a maker of doll clothes. And you can see just barely here, perhaps, that the bodice is actually made of silk that's been covered over with wax. And back here, the hair is actual horsehair wig. And it's been real hair that's been plaited and then again covered with wax by Degas to integrate it into this sculpted head. Attached to it then was a ribbon and then a skirt which was made out of tulle, just like a dancer's skirt would have been. The shoes also were real dancer slippers, now embedded in the wax, and up her legs went little ribbons that are likewise embedded into the wax. The stockings are actually just sculpted by Degas, not real silk stockings. These come out of a series of waxes that he had made beginning in the mid-1870s and which go on into his career, though they're often very hard to date. We don't have too many points of contact with Degas. We know that he was working on the little 14-year-old dancer in about 1879, 80, 81. We have another work by him, The Tub, which comes a little bit later. But some of these we just have to guess at based on the resemblance that they have to signed and dated works on flat surfaces, on paintings or paper. But these notions of the pose, going back to Duranty's notion of how we should study the body and let it dictate character for us, here in the wonderful etching, this is also in Toledo, of Mary Cassatt and her sister Lydia at the Louvre. Or I extend this because this wonderful sculpture of a horse, so balletic in its movement, is actually in the exhibition upstairs as well. But the little 14-year-old dancer was a real turning point for Degas, because it became a kind of public manifesto of his fascination for the ballet and for the realness of it. A statement of the fact that his works were not simply excuse me, I had this better image of the silk there. You can see that it really is real silk. And down here you can get the notion that this really is a button, a real functioning button. The world of Degas' little 14-year-old dancer is not the world of L'Étoile, the wonderful pastel that he had made around 1876 and became part of the collection of Gustave Caillebotte before the Impressionist exhibition of 1877. This dancer here is something completely different from this. This is the dancer at work behind the stage, using a pose that is all about stretching. It's not particularly gainly as a ballet move, but it really is a movement that a dancer would use to stretch her shoulder blades and to keep her back in movement through the period of resting. And in this regard, she's much more like the images of dancers seen behind the scenes. Here, one reading the newspaper with a pot of coffee on a stove in the middle of the rehearsal room, and also connecting to the notion of the youth of these children who were brought into the Paris Opera. Now, the notion that I talked to you before of Degas employing one model to make many drawings is also critical for the understanding of the little 14-year-old dancer and its elaboration. And here, position and if you will, sort of a kind of musical movement, and above all, the question of time plays another role in the discussion. Because from the 3 drawings of a single dancer that Degas made probably in the late 1860s, early 1870s, Degas moves in the late 1870s to drawing one girl again and again, but having her hold the same pose and having himself move around her. Now, in writing about this idea, he said that you could actually use a mirror to accomplish this, that the mirror would move round the figure, you would stay in the same place, and you would be drawing effectively what was in the mirror, which kept the figure turning and seeing it from reflecting it from different points of view. Whether Degas actually ever used that mirror technique, or whether he simply had the dancer turn or himself took up a chair and moved round her to get multiple points of view, we can't say. But here you have Marie van Goerten seen from 4 points of view. Here her legs seen from 5. And her naked body, obviously the sort of preparation for making the Nude study, of which you have a cast in Toledo, showing her ungainly sort of figure, clothed again in 3 different positions, 2 more, 3 more, so that by the time you put all these together, you effectively have got the dancer on a lazy Susan turning in front of you. So already you're now you've moved through space and time, and you're in a 3rd dimension. Sounds like the Twilight Zone here. But you are all ready to make a sculpture. And to make a sculpture a nude study, and then to make the final 3-dimensional object. Now, this notion, however, of repetition was, you've already seen something that was inherent in Degas' art, where he took that leaning dancer adjusting her slipper and used her again and again and again. Here he takes the figure and draws it again and again and again. It's something that had gone on in his art. Here, the study of Marie van Gerten, seen from various angles. Remember the images I showed you earlier of a man, this same model. I showed you two other images of him. Here, he is in a position of astonishment, exactly the same pose, held by the model and drawn by the artist from two different points of view. He could draw multiple sheets of studies in which the same figure would be disported across the page in various different positions. Or he could even take a sheet like this one where a dancer seems to be talking to herself as if in a mirror. Here, two different images, but almost certainly drawn from the same figure who was just then turned round and seemed to put herself into conversation with herself. The repetition of a form across a page, here the hands and the legs of this Spanish dancer in a wonderful sheet from the Musée d'Orsay, or a dancer, a café concert singer shown with or without her bodice in the same singing pose in a wonderful pastel from a private collection. So this notion of the repetition ties in as well with a deeper sense of understanding of the face and the form. Let me go back here. If you look at this drawing, you can see how completely unidealizing, you might even say unsympathetic, Degas is towards recording the face of this little girl. One of the images is just barely okay, but this one seems to be dead-eyed, and this one seems to be almost like an orangutan. There's something about the head of this girl that is a little bit off-putting, and this was certainly the reaction to the muzzle of the child that the critics had when they saw it in 1881. Now, it goes. It's a fascinating thing that at the same exhibition where Degas showed the little 14-year-old dancer, he also showed these portraits of criminals, actual criminals that he had witnessed in the defendant's box at a trial where these two young men were being tried for the murder of a grocer and his wife, and the two men had met when they were walk-ons in a stage production of a play by Zola. So it is completely about the naturalist world, not only being reflected in art, but actually having an action in art. That these people went from being characters in a Zola novel or a play on stage, they actually met there and became criminals themselves. The connection between the criminal face of these two young men and the certainly in most conservative critics' points of view, the sort of depraved vision of the little 14-year-old dancer was not lost on many people who went to the 1881 exhibition. And in 1878, but I wanted to say, remember though that this goes back in Degas' art all the way back to the beginnings of his interest in the nude, and here I just make a comparison between the leftmost drawing of the figure in the nude drawing and that wonderful sheet that I showed you of a boy seen from behind in the Little Spartans. Now, imagine this sculpture made out of wax. And when we see her in bronze, we think of her as being metal and a work of art. In wax, with all of the fabric and the hair and the ribbons and the bows, she seemed very much like a kind of wax museum specimen. And this is what people commented on again and again, as almost as if she were from a natural history museum. And I show you a great comparison that my friends Douglas Struick and Peter Zegers discovered of a figure of a woman from I believe from Samoa, that was shown at the 1878 World's Fair. And this was a wax figure of an actual human being, very much of the kind of object that Degas was making when he made this little dancer. But I would repeat for you that the three-dimensional object, though I've talked about its meaning within modern life, is fundamentally based on a notion of drawing in Degas' art. Drawing was, I think, the sort of moral center, or the sort of intellectual and moral center of all of Degas' art making. And whether it's a painting, a sculpture, or an actual drawing, the notion of line making and the delineation of a figure is really critical. So that these drawings, the notion of seeing something repeated times, recording it a number of times, is absolutely critical in understanding Degas' art. And when you look into the world of Degas, you will see, as you go around museums in this country or in Europe, you will see again memories and echoes of things that you have seen here in Toledo in the wonderful exhibition upstairs. You'll see, maybe in Chicago sometime, you'll see this drawing on exhibition, and you'll realize that yes, it's all connected. The whole oeuvre of Degas is so closely connected that one thing touches on another, touches on another. And so the figures seen again and again and again are ideas that move through his art, not only in the early 1880s, but into the very end of the 1880s, into the early 1890s, again and again, fascinated by the repetition of a form, the turning of a figure. Let's see something twice, let's see it three times, let's see it from two or three different angles. And let's make variants on things. Let's not make something once, let's make it twice, let's make it two or three times. Let's take a pastel that we've got here at the left. Let's go in, let's take a piece of tracing paper, let's put it down on top of the pastel, make a drawing on top of it, use that drawing, then take it away from the original pastel, make something new out of it, make a repetition, make a second version, make a third version. Let's put a wet one next to a dry one, take a wet piece of paper and have it print onto another piece of paper, or let's take a piece of tracing paper and simply turn it over and then draw again on the back side using our original tracing as a mark. All of these ideas are possible in Degas, and this sense of restless innovation and a kind of desire to do something experimental just for the sake of seeing what might happen, I think is really down at the core of his genius, in fact. So that we have again and again the same poses in variant forms. And I showed you these from Zurich, from Toledo, and from the Waldorf Arts Museum as examples of the kinds of repetition that Degas really excelled in. And then at the end of this career, not only is he interested in making formal repetitions, but he's interested in making, to use a musical phrase, variations, so that he establishes the theme and then does it in multiple different moods and different ways. From a group of photographs that he made, and we know them as negatives only, as negatives that have developed a very strange color. Here are two photographs of the negatives seen against a lighted background so that you can see vaguely in them a dancer who's reaching up and reaching towards probably a folding screen in the studio. You can see a cloth draped over the screen. You can see her ruffled chemise and her drop-waisted tutu skirt here. Here you see the same dancer, except that the in the process of developing the negative, it's gone slightly solarized. It's kind of reversed its values. And you see her with what would be the lightest part rendering as dark here. And you see that arm up, adjusting the shoulder strap, another one going over. There again, the ruffled top of the blouse, the chemise, and then down here, the gathered skirt below. And then sort of places where the wet collodion negative or some kind of negative has gathered and puddled. The color of these may have been already there and interesting to Degas, but we don't really know how they looked when they came out of the bath. But we know that they inspired a number of works across this time in Degas' career. He began photographing in the about 1895, and was fascinated by it into the late 1890s. And then we see him making these images that are rather ghostly and often having a very kind of strange and moody light. Remember the way that you saw the light on that arm of the dancer that relates very closely to this in the photograph I just showed you. And the light falling on the figure here. This is a wonderful sheet from the Pulitzer collection in St. Louis. Repeated again, rearranged on the picture space so that you see nothing of the reaching figure here, just her arm. And this one is cropped here in the middle. And there they are, the arm has turned back. This is a beautiful photograph that used to be in the Durango collection, it's now in a New York private collection. And this one from the Pushkin Museum of Art in Moscow. There's Our Lady again. And there's our reaching arm. And then here's the beautiful, beautiful pastel in Toledo. If you haven't seen it ever, you must leave here and go upstairs and look at it again. I hope you can. I'm not sure whether we're open tonight. But you must see it. It's one of the most beautiful of this whole series. And as you can see, they act like a series of movements in a musical composition, one in tones of green and pink, one all in blue, and the other dominated by orange and blue. And then within them, they are more and more complicated. He takes the notion of the pastel and extends it to oil in the great picture at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. But it's back in the medium of pastel that we feel him really at home. Mixing colors, dry color over dry color, sometimes wetting down the pastel, making it sing in little transparent layers, and coming up with something that is almost ineffably beautiful. So music, drawing, time all come to express the dance in the art of Degas. And I thank you very much for your attention this evening.